shit! Did you see that? Did...
Beneath the cover of night and deep within remote wilderness, strange disturbances often leave behind more questions than answers. Camps collapse, vehicles overturn, and survivors whisper of overwhelming force paired with unnerving precision. In some cases, belongings are rearranged into deliberate patterns, while in others, people vanish without a trace, leaving only massive, human-like footprints fading into fog or snow. From a shaken bus station in Texas to a vanishing climber on Spain's cliffs, these events span continents and terrors. In this video, we'll uncover 6 chilling encounters that defy explanation. The remote bus station sat like a forgotten outpost along Highway 287 in rural Hardeman County, Texas, where the rolling plains stretched endlessly under star-scattered skies. Built in 1987 to serve the scattered ranching communities, the modest station had weathered decades of economic decline, leaving it increasingly isolated as passenger numbers dwindled. By September 2025, only 2 buses per day stopped at the weathered concrete platform surrounded by scrubland and mesquite trees. The nearest town lay 37 miles east, making it one of the loneliest transit points in the Texas Panhandle. Miguel Torres had been driving buses for Lone Star Transit for 12 years, a job that suited his preference for solitude and the open road. At 43, the soft-spoken man from San Antonio had grown accustomed to the peculiar rhythm of overnight stops at remote stations. His route covered a 400-mile circuit through small Texas towns, often requiring mandatory rest periods at isolated locations like the Hardeman County Station. Company regulations prohibited driving more than 10 consecutive hours, so Miguel had parked his 40-foot passenger bus in the designated area beside the small terminal building just after 11 p.m. on September 4th. The September night carried the last breath of summer heat, with temperatures still hovering near 80 degrees despite the late hour. Miguel had settled into the driver's seat with a thermos of coffee and a paperback novel, planning to catch a few hours of rest before his 6 a.m. departure. The station's single security light cast a pale yellow glow across the empty parking area, while beyond its reach, the Texas wilderness disappeared into complete darkness. Crickets chirped from the surrounding brush, and occasionally the distant lowing of cattle drifted across the still air. Around midnight, Miguel had dozed off with his book resting on his chest when the first tremor shook the bus. Initially, he dismissed it as wind gusts common to the open plains, but the shaking intensified into violent rocking that jolted him fully awake. The massive vehicle swayed side to side with such force that Miguel gripped the steering wheel to steady himself. Through the darkened windows, he could see nothing beyond the security light's weak illumination. Then came the sounds that would haunt him for months afterward. Deep scratching noises scraped along the bus's aluminum siding, starting near the front wheel wells and moving methodically toward the rear. The metallic screech sent chills down Miguel's spine as whatever was outside seemed to be testing the vehicle's surface with deliberate precision. Each scratch lasted several seconds, as if massive claws were slowly dragging across the metal panels. Miguel's heart hammered against his ribs as he debated whether to start the engine and flee or remain perfectly still. His radio crackled with static when he reached for it, but the nearest dispatcher station was 40 miles away with uncertain reception. The scratching sounds continued their systematic progression around the bus, occasionally accompanied by heavy thuds that shook the entire vehicle. Miguel pressed himself deeper into the driver's seat, barely breathing as he strained to glimpse whatever lurked in the darkness beyond the windows. After what felt like an eternity but probably lasted only 10 minutes, the disturbance ceased as abruptly as it had begun. The bus stopped rocking, the scratching sounds vanished, and even the crickets fell silent. Miguel waited another 20 minutes before daring to peer through the windshield, but the darkness revealed nothing. The security light continued its solitary vigil over the empty parking area, casting the same pale circle of illumination it had maintained all evening. Sleep proved impossible for the remainder of the night. Miguel sat rigid in his seat, every sense alert for any resumption of the mysterious activity. When dawn finally broke across the eastern horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, he cautiously exited the bus to assess any damage. What he discovered sent a fresh wave of unease through his already frayed nerves. Deep gouges scored the bus's metal siding in parallel lines, each scratch approximately 4 inches apart and running in sets of 4. The marks were too precise and too deep to have been caused by wind-blown debris or tree branches. They appeared to have been deliberately carved into the aluminum by something with extraordinary strength and sharp appendages. Miguel traced the scratches with his finger, noting how they formed consistent patterns along both sides of the vehicle. More disturbing was the condition of the luggage compartments underneath the bus. Though Miguel distinctly remembered securing them the previous evening, he found the external storage bays open with their contents removed. Suitcases, duffel bags, and cargo boxes had been arranged in neat stacks beside the bus, organized with an almost obsessive attention to order. Each stack contained items of similar size and weight, as if something had methodically sorted the luggage according to unknown criteria. Inside the terminal building, Miguel discovered that the plastic benches had been moved. The 4 bench seats that normally faced the ticket counter had been repositioned to form a perfect square in the center of the waiting area. No human could have moved the heavy, bolted-down furniture without proper tools, yet each bench remained undamaged and positioned with mathematical precision. As Miguel loaded his radio to report the incident to dispatch, movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention. Beyond the mesquite brush that bordered the parking area, a massive figure stood motionless among the scattered trees. Even at a distance of roughly 100 yards, Miguel could discern its enormous proportions and broad shoulders that seemed to dwarf the surrounding vegetation. The figure appeared humanoid, but far larger than any person, standing perfectly still as it seemed to observe him. Miguel blinked and looked again, but the figure had vanished as if it had never existed. Only the swaying branches of the mesquite trees suggested that something substantial had recently moved through the area. He rubbed his eyes and stared at the spot for several more minutes, but nothing reappeared. When the Texas Department of Public Safety responded to Miguel's report later that morning, Officer Janet Carmichael dismissed the incident as probable vandalism by local teenagers. She photographed the scratches and documented the rearranged luggage, but showed little interest in Miguel's description of the mysterious figure. Her report classified the case as property damage caused by unknown juveniles, despite the obvious impossibility of teenagers moving bolted furniture or creating such precise gouges in aluminum siding. Local residents in the nearby town of Childress, however, received Miguel's account with knowing nods and meaningful glances. Several mentioned similar encounters over the years, whispered stories of something large and intelligent that watched from the wilderness. They spoke of livestock found arranged in strange patterns, of equipment mysteriously relocated overnight, and of glimpses of massive figures that disappeared when directly observed. Miguel completed his route that day but requested reassignment to avoid returning to the remote station. Company officials granted his transfer without question, noting his 12-year record of reliable service. He never spoke publicly about his experience again, but fellow drivers occasionally noticed him checking his mirrors more frequently and avoiding overnight stops at isolated locations. The Hardeman County Bus Station continued operating its limited schedule, though several subsequent drivers reported similar disturbances. The terminal building's benches required repeated repairs as they continued moving into unusual configurations, and the security cameras installed by the transit company suffered mysterious malfunctions whenever anything interesting occurred. Miguel eventually relocated to urban routes in Dallas, finding comfort in the city's constant illumination and crowds of people. Yet sometimes, during quiet moments in heavy traffic, he would catch himself scanning the horizon for broad-shouldered figures that shouldn't exist, but somehow did. The Kamchatka Peninsula stretched across Russia's far eastern frontier like a forgotten wilderness, where volcanic peaks pierced the sky and pristine rivers carved through valleys untouched by modern civilization. In March 2019, This remote region had become the destination of choice for wealthy hunters seeking trophy experiences unavailable elsewhere on Earth. The peninsula's isolation, accessible only by helicopter or chartered aircraft, attracted those willing to pay extraordinary sums for exclusive hunting expeditions far from the scrutiny of conservation groups. Dmitry Volkov, a 52-year-old petroleum executive from Moscow, had paid nearly $40,000 for a week-long hunting package with a specialized wilderness outfitter, a company focusing on extreme wilderness experiences for Russia's elite. The expedition promised encounters with brown bears, wolves, and other apex predators in their natural habitat, guided by local experts who knew the terrain's most productive hunting grounds. Dmitry had arrived at the base camp 3 days earlier, accompanied by 2 professional guides and a support crew of 4, all established on the banks of the Kamchatka River, where salmon runs attracted substantial wildlife. The morning of March 15th began with temperatures hovering near -10 degrees Celsius, typical for the region's late winter conditions. Dmitry had expressed particular interest in tracking a large brown bear whose prints the guides had discovered near their camp the previous evening. The massive tracks, measuring nearly 12 inches long, suggested an exceptionally large male emerging from winter hibernation. Such specimens represented the ultimate prize for trophy hunters, combining rarity with the inherent danger that justified the expedition's exorbitant cost. Lead guide Sergei Petrov, a weathered man in his 40s with 20 years of experience in the Kamchatka wilderness, had warned Dmitry about the unpredictable nature of newly awakened bears. However, the wealthy executive insisted on pursuing the animal, claiming that danger was precisely what he had paid to experience. The hunting party departed camp at dawn, following the bear tracks along a frozen tributary that wound through dense forests of birch and fir trees. After 3 hours of tracking through increasingly difficult terrain, the guide suggested returning to camp for lunch and warmer clothing. Dmitry reluctantly agreed, though he expressed frustration at their lack of success in locating the bear. The group began their return journey around noon, with Dmitry walking slightly behind the others as he photographed the dramatic landscape for his collection of hunting memorabilia. When the party arrived back at camp at approximately 1:30 p.m., guide Viktor Morozov immediately noticed that Dmitry was no longer with them. The group had been walking in single file through a narrow canyon, and the guides assumed Dmitry was following at his usual distance. A quick search of the immediate area revealed no sign of the missing hunter, prompting Sergei to organize a more systematic search of their return route. After 2 hours of increasingly frantic searching, Viktor discovered Dmitry's body floating face down in the icy river, approximately half a mile from their camp. The executive's expensive hunting rifle lay submerged nearby, and his backpack had been torn from his shoulders. Initial examination suggested drowning, though several details immediately struck the guides as unusual and deeply disturbing. Deep bruises marked Dmitry's arms and shoulders, in patterns consistent with being grabbed and dragged by something with enormous strength. The bruising appeared fresh, occurring shortly before his death, and the spacing suggested hands or appendages far larger than those of any human. Long scratches raked across his back had torn through his heavy winter clothing and scored the flesh beneath in parallel lines approximately 4 inches apart. Most unsettling were the massive footprints discovered in the snow along the riverbank. The prints measured over 24 inches in length and showed clear toe impressions, suggesting a bipedal creature of extraordinary size. The tracks led from the forest edge directly to where Dmitry's body had been found, then continued along the water's edge before disappearing on rocky ground that retained no impressions. Dmitry's personal effects had been arranged in neat stacks along the riverbank, including his expensive camera, GPS device, and emergency flare gun. Each item had been placed with deliberate care, forming precise geometric patterns that suggested intelligence rather than random scattering by wildlife or water current. His wallet, containing over 3,000 rubles and several credit cards, remained untouched in his jacket pocket. The guides reported hearing strange guttural growls during the previous night, sounds they had initially attributed to distant bears or wolves. However, the vocalizations had come from multiple directions simultaneously, suggesting either a pack of unknown animals or something capable of ventilating its voice across great distances. Several crew members claimed to have glimpsed a broad-shouldered figure moving upright among the trees before dawn, though the darkness and blowing snow made positive identification impossible. When authorities from the regional capital arrived by helicopter 2 days later, they conducted a thorough investigation that concluded Dmitry had accidentally fallen into the river and drowned. The official report attributed the bruising and scratches to impact with rocks and debris during his fall, despite the guide's insistence that such injuries were inconsistent with accidental drowning. The arranged personal effects were dismissed as having been scattered by the water current and coincidentally deposited in their organized patterns. Local indigenous people, however, received news of the incident with grim recognition rather than surprise. They spoke in hushed tones of something ancient that inhabited the deepest wilderness, a creature intelligent enough to hunt humans while leaving minimal evidence of its involvement. They warned that such beings were drawn to those who entered their territory with violent intentions, particularly hunters seeking to kill for sport rather than survival. The remaining expedition members departed Kamchatka immediately after the investigation concluded, their hunting adventure permanently terminated. The wilderness outfitter quietly ceased operations 6 months later, citing insurance difficulties and declining bookings. Sergei and Victor returned to guiding fishing expeditions exclusively, refusing all subsequent requests for hunting tours in the remote interior. The Kamchatka Peninsula continued attracting adventure tourists and researchers, though stories of Dmitry's fate circulated among outdoor enthusiasts as a cautionary tale about the dangers of pursuing unknown predators in Russia's most isolated wilderness areas. The remote stretches of Highway 191 through southwestern Wyoming represented some of the most desolate patrol territory in the United States, where a single officer might drive for hours without encountering another vehicle. In October 2022, this isolated region had become the responsibility of Wyoming Highway Patrol Officer Daniel Brooks, a 15-year veteran who specialized in monitoring the vast wilderness corridors that connected Yellowstone National Park to the Colorado border. The area encompassed over 300 square miles of high desert, scattered ranches, and endless sagebrush plains where elk migrations and severe weather created unique hazards for travelers. Daniel had grown accustomed to the profound solitude of night shifts along these forgotten highways, where his patrol unit served as the only law enforcement presence across thousands of acres of raw wilderness. At 38 years old, the former Marine found comfort in the vast spaces and star-filled skies that reminded him of deployments in remote overseas locations. His beat included responsibility for a 40-mile section of highway that saw fewer than 20 vehicles per night during the slow autumn months. The evening of October 23rd began routinely enough, with Daniel conducting his standard patrol checks at truck stops and rest areas scattered along his assigned route. Temperature had dropped to 28 degrees, typical for late October in the region, and a thin layer of frost coated the sagebrush and fence posts that lined the empty highway. Daniel's patrol SUV, equipped with heavy-duty winter tires and emergency equipment, handled the conditions easily as he made his rounds through the familiar territory. Around 11:45 p.m., Daniel radioed dispatch to report his location at mile marker 127, approximately 30 miles south of the nearest town. He mentioned conducting a routine check of a maintenance road that provided access to communication towers serving the remote region. These tower roads required periodic inspection for vandalism or equipment theft, though such crimes were rare in the isolated area. Daniel's transmission indicated normal conditions, and an estimated return to highway patrol within 30 minutes. His next radio contact came at 12:23 a.m., when Daniel's voice crackled through static to report unusual activity near his vehicle. He described heavy impacts against the patrol SUV that seemed to come from multiple directions, accompanied by deep, guttural growls that he initially thought might indicate a bear encounter. Daniel mentioned seeing movement in his headlights, but noted that whatever was outside appeared much larger than typical wildlife for the region. The transmission cut off abruptly during Daniel's attempt to request backup assistance from the nearest patrol unit, which was stationed over 60 miles away in Pinedale. Dispatch attempted to re-establish contact for the next 47 minutes without success, growing increasingly concerned as Daniel failed to respond to repeated radio calls. His GPS locator showed the patrol vehicle stationary at mile marker 127, but no movement or response could be detected. A Wyoming Highway Patrol supervisor and 2 county sheriff's deputies reached Daniel's last known location at 2:15 a.m., following the maintenance road to where his patrol SUV lay on its side in a shallow depression beside the gravel track. The vehicle's emergency lights continued flashing, illuminating a scene that defied easy explanation or rational understanding. The patrol SUV had been completely overturned, coming to rest on its passenger side with the windshield blown outward in a pattern suggesting tremendous internal pressure rather than external impact. Daniel's seatbelt had been torn completely apart, leaving frayed nylon ends that appeared to have been ripped by an enormous force. His service weapon lay untouched in its holster on the driver's side floor, with all 6 rounds still loaded and the safety engaged. Deep gouges scarred the SUV's hood and roof panels, forming parallel scratches approximately 4 inches apart that appeared to have been made by massive claws. The scratches were too deep and precise to have resulted from rolling over rocky ground, and their systematic placement suggested deliberate rather than accidental damage. Similar markings covered the vehicle's doors and rear panel, as if something had methodically raked its claws across every accessible surface. The surrounding sagebrush showed clear signs of disturbance, with multiple plants uprooted or broken in a winding path that led away from the overturned vehicle toward a rocky outcropping approximately 200 yards distant. Investigators discovered enormous footprints in the soft earth near the SUV, measuring nearly 24 inches in length and showing distinct toe impressions that suggested a bipedal creature of extraordinary proportions. Most puzzling was the arrangement of equipment from Daniel's patrol unit. Items from the trunk had been removed and stacked in neat piles along the roadside, including emergency flares, first aid supplies, and traffic cones. Each stack contained items of similar size and function, organized with an attention to order that suggested intelligence and purpose rather than random scattering by wild animals or impact forces. Daniel's radio, normally mounted on the dashboard, had been carefully placed on top of one of these equipment stacks, positioned as if displayed for easy discovery by arriving investigators. His patrol cap sat precisely centered on another pile, and his citation book lay open to a blank page beside a stack of emergency triangles. The deliberate arrangement strongly suggested that whatever had overturned the vehicle possessed both the intelligence and dexterity to manipulate objects with careful intention. Despite extensive ground and aerial searches involving dozens of personnel over the following week, no trace of Daniel Brooks was ever discovered. Search dogs lost their scent trail at the rocky outcropping where the footprints disappeared, and helicopter surveys of the surrounding wilderness revealed no additional clues. The massive footprints provided the only tangible evidence of what had occurred, though official reports classified the incident as a single-vehicle accident with the victim thrown clear and subsequently lost in the harsh terrain. Local ranchers and longtime residents of the region, however, received news of Daniel's disappearance with knowing resignation rather than surprise. They spoke quietly of similar incidents over the decades, mysterious disappearances of hunters and travelers who ventured too far into the remote wilderness areas. These conversations inevitably included references to something massive and intelligent that inhabited the deepest canyons and highest ridges, emerging only to remove those who posed potential threats to its territory. The Wyoming Range Riders transferred Daniel's patrol sector to 2 officers working in pairs, implementing new policies requiring regular radio contact and partner backup for all remote area investigations. The maintenance road where Daniel disappeared was closed to routine patrol checks, officially due to budget constraints, but unofficially because no officer volunteered to work the area alone. The overturned patrol SUV was eventually towed to the state impound facility, where it served as a reminder of the mysterious incident that claimed one of Wyoming's most experienced highway officers. Daniel's family received full benefits and commendations, though they continued pressing for additional investigation into the circumstances of his disappearance. The remote stretches of Highway 191 continued requiring patrol coverage, though officers approached the assignment with new awareness of the vast wilderness that surrounded their lonely vigil through Wyoming's endless night. The Cascade Range Recreational Area in Central Oregon had operated since 1983, offering secluded RV camping sites among Douglas fir and ponderosa pine forests, 43 miles east of Sisters. By August 2021, the privately owned facility housed 12 sites with electrical hookups, connected by gravel roads winding through dense timber where wildlife frequently appeared. Maya Hayes, a freelance graphic designer from Portland, had arrived on August 14th with her boyfriend Liam Porter, a software engineer who shared her passion for wilderness photography. The couple reserved Site 7 for a week-long retreat, parking their 28-foot travel trailer in a forest clearing. Maya planned to work on a Seattle marketing project, while Liam photographed local wildlife. They spent 3 days exploring trails and documenting bird life in the old-growth forest. Other campers included retirees and families seeking respite from the unusually hot Pacific Northwest summer. On August 17th, Maya and Liam joined other campers around the communal fire pit, sharing stories before retiring to their trailer at 10:30 p.m., planning an early photography expedition to a nearby waterfall. Maya awakened at 6:15 a.m. to commotion outside, initially assuming early rising campers were preparing for day trips. However, sounds intensified into crashes and shouts, suggesting something serious. She felt strangely disoriented, unable to form coherent thoughts or coordinate movements effectively. When Maya emerged from the trailer around 7 a.m., she discovered complete devastation. The organized campground had become a disaster zone with overturned RVs scattered across the forest floor. Travel trailers lay flipped upside down or on their sides with shredded awnings and destroyed slide-out sections. Fire pits throughout the park were filled with camping equipment, creating bizarre sculptures of folding chairs, coolers, and cooking utensils in precise geometric arrangements. Picnic tables stood stacked impossibly high, requiring mechanical equipment to achieve. The concrete restroom building's metal door was torn from its hinges and deposited 30 feet away. Maya herself bore evidence of some violent encounter that remained completely absent from her memory. Deep scratches marked her forearms through her torn jacket, and her clothing showed signs of being grabbed and pulled by something with enormous strength. However, she retained absolutely no recollection of being attacked, fleeing from danger, or even leaving her trailer during the night. The last thing she remembered clearly was falling asleep beside Liam around 11 p.m. Other campers emerged from the wreckage in various states of confusion and injury, though none could provide coherent accounts of what had occurred during the night. Several reported similar memory gaps and unexplained injuries, including bruises and scratches that suggested physical encounters they could not recall. The elderly couple from Site 3 mentioned hearing tremendous crashes and inhuman roaring sounds, but claimed they had remained hidden in their overturned RV until daylight made movement safe. Investigation of the surrounding forest revealed enormous footprints pressed deep into the soft earth between the camping sites. The prints measured well over 24 inches in length and showed clear toe impressions that indicated a bipedal creature of extraordinary size and weight. The tracks formed irregular loops around the entire campground, suggesting systematic surveillance or reconnaissance that had preceded the apparent attack. Most disturbing was the methodical arrangement of personal belongings throughout the devastated area. Coolers, camping chairs, and recreational equipment had been sorted and stacked according to size and function, forming neat piles that contrasted sharply with the chaotic destruction of the RVs themselves. Clothing and personal items hung from tree branches in organized displays, as if someone had carefully cataloged and presented the contents of every overturned trailer. Park manager Russell Chen, who lived in a cabin near the entrance, claimed to have slept through the entire incident, despite the apparent magnitude of the disturbance. His building showed no damage, and his vehicle remained untouched, though he admitted hearing strange sounds during the night that he had attributed to elk moving through the area. Chen appeared genuinely shocked by the destruction, but offered no useful information about potential causes. When Deschutes Valley Marshal Service deputies arrived at the scene, they initially suspected vandalism by local teenagers or environmental activists opposed to recreational development in forest areas. However, the scale of destruction and the systematic arrangement of equipment suggested coordination and strength far beyond human capabilities. Several RVs weighed over 8,000 pounds and would have required heavy machinery to overturn and relocate. The official investigation classified the incident as vandalism by unknown perpetrators, though deputies privately acknowledged that no known group possessed the equipment or motivation to create such extensive and organized destruction. Insurance companies eventually paid claims totaling over $400,000, but several policies contained exclusions for acts of unknown origin that complicated settlements for affected campers. Local residents and Forest Service personnel received news of the incident with uncomfortable recognition rather than surprise. Conversations in nearby towns invariably included references to similar events over the years, mysterious encounters with something massive and intelligent that emerged from the deepest forest areas to demonstrate its presence through overwhelming displays of power. Maya and Liam relocated to a hotel in Sisters for the remainder of their vacation. Though Maya continued experiencing memory gaps and unexplained anxiety attacks for several months afterward, she eventually sought counseling to address persistent nightmares and fears of wilderness camping, though she could never recall specific details about what had frightened her so profoundly. The recreational park suspended operations indefinitely following the incident, citing insurance difficulties and declining reservations. Russell Chen moved to California 3 months later, selling the property to a timber company that converted the former campground back to managed forest land. The Cascade Range continued attracting outdoor enthusiasts and wildlife photographers, though experienced local guides quietly advised visitors against camping in the remote interior areas, where something ancient and powerful preferred to remain undisturbed by human presence. The rugged coastline of Asturias in northern Spain presented some of Europe's most dramatic climbing terrain, where limestone cliffs rose 400 meters above the Cantabrian Sea. By September 2018, the coastal peaks near Ribadesella had developed a reputation among international climbers for challenging multi-pitch routes, combining technical difficulty with spectacular ocean views. Luis Ortega, a 34-year-old structural engineer from Madrid, had been climbing these coastal routes for 8 years. His climbing partner, Marina Velasco, a geological surveyor from Barcelona, shared his passion for the region's unique limestone formations and sense of isolation from camping on remote cliff tops above the pounding surf. The pair arrived at their chosen campsite on September 22nd, establishing base camp on a narrow ledge 200 meters above sea level. The location provided access to several unclimbed routes they had identified, including a challenging overhang requiring advanced technical skills. Luis and Marina completed 2 successful climbs during their first 3 days, documenting new routes with photographs and GPS coordinates. On the evening of September 25th, heavy fog rolled in from the Atlantic, reducing visibility to 50 meters. Luis expressed concern about continuing climbs and limited visibility, but Marina suggested waiting until morning. They retired around 10 p.m., planning to assess conditions at first light. Marina later recalled hearing distant thuds during the night, initially attributing them to waves, but noting they seemed to come from the rocky plateau above rather than the ocean below. When Marina awakened at 6:30 a.m., Luis had vanished completely. His sleeping bag lay neatly arranged beside cold ashes, with his climbing harness and rope coiled precisely beside it. His belongings remained untouched, including wallet, identification, and emergency communication device. Most puzzling, was the complete absence of footprints or signs of departure from the campsite. Marina searched for over an hour, finding no trace of Luis's presence. The fog limited visibility, but she discovered disturbing evidence in the damp soil. Massive footprints pressed deep into the earth formed irregular circles around their camping area, each measuring over 24 inches with clear toe impressions, indicating a bipedal creature of enormous proportions. Small stones had been arranged into deliberate cairns along the cliff edge, stacked with mathematical precision into structures that definitely had not existed when Luis and Marina established their campsite. Each cairn contained exactly 7 stones of graduated sizes, positioned at regular intervals along a 100-meter section of the cliff top. The careful arrangement suggested intelligence and purpose rather than natural geological processes or coincidental rockfalls. As the fog began lifting around noon, Marina caught a glimpse of something that would haunt her for years afterward. A towering figure stood motionless on a rocky outcropping approximately 300 meters from her campsite, broad-shouldered and upright in a distinctly humanoid posture, but far larger than any person she had ever seen. The figure remained perfectly still for several minutes, seeming to observe her activities, before the shifting fog concealed it once again. When Marina returned to the spot where she had seen the figure, she found only empty rock formations and no evidence of recent occupation. However, the stone surface showed scratches and gouges that appeared fresh, as if something with claws had recently gripped the limestone while climbing or positioning itself for observation. The marks formed patterns too regular to be natural weathering but too large to have been made by known wildlife in the region. Spanish Civil Guard officers responded to Marina's emergency call, arriving by helicopter at the clifftop campsite late that afternoon. The official search and rescue operation continued for 5 days, involving experienced mountain rescue teams, trained search dogs, and aerial surveillance of the extensive coastline. Despite comprehensive efforts covering over 20 square kilometers of rugged terrain, no trace of Luis Ortega was ever discovered. The investigation concluded that Luis had likely fallen from the cliff during the night, possibly while investigating sounds or attempting to secure equipment in the heavy fog. Officials noted that the limestone cliffs were notorious for unexpected rockfalls and unstable edges that could collapse without warning, particularly during periods of heavy moisture that weakened the stone's integrity. However, the absence of any disturbance around Luis's sleeping area and the presence of his carefully arranged equipment suggested a far different scenario than accidental death by falling. Marina's account of the massive footprints and arranged stones was documented but dismissed as evidence of local wildlife and natural geological processes that could create misleading impressions under stressful circumstances. Local residents of Ribadesella and surrounding villages received news of Luis's disappearance with somber recognition, rather than shock. Elderly fishermen and farmers spoke quietly of similar incidents over the generations, mysterious vanishings of individuals who ventured too far into the wild coastal areas during foggy nights. They warned that something ancient inhabited the highest cliffs and deepest caves, emerging during periods of poor visibility to remove those who intruded upon its territory. Marina returned to Barcelona permanently shaken by her experience, abandoning coastal climbing in favor of interior mountain ranges, where the terrain felt safer and more predictable. She continued experiencing nightmares about the broad-shouldered figure in the fog, and eventually sought professional counseling to address persistent anxiety attacks, triggered by memories of that final morning alone on the cliff. The climbing routes that Luis and Marina had been documenting remained unfinished, their detailed notes and photographs eventually donated to Spanish mountaineering archives. The specific campsite where Luis vanished developed an unofficial reputation among experienced climbers as a location to be avoided, particularly during periods of heavy fog when visibility dropped below safe levels for technical climbing operations. The vast tundra of Canada's northern Yukon Territory stretched toward the Arctic Ocean, where temperatures regularly dropped below -40 degrees. In February 2020, This remote wilderness served as the research location for a joint wildlife study by the Federal Wildlife Service and a prominent northern university, focusing on Arctic fox populations 68 kilometers north of Old Crow. Dr. Elena Frost, a wildlife biologist from a major eastern Canadian university, had spent 6 weeks at the remote station documenting fox behavior and collecting tissue samples. Her research partner, Mark Svensson, a graduate student from a prestigious Montreal-based institution, assisted with data collection and maintained sophisticated monitoring equipment tracking animal movements across thousands of acres. Their research cabin, constructed in 1987, provided basic shelter while housing scientific equipment worth over $200,000. The heavily insulated structure included backup generators, emergency communications, and storage areas for research samples requiring specific temperature controls. The night of February 18th began with temperatures at -37 degrees. Elena and Mark completed daily data collection, checking trap lines and logging observations. Around 9 p.m., heavy thuds began echoing from outside the cabin walls, moving systematically around the perimeter with deep guttural growls that didn't match known wildlife species. The disturbance intensified over 2 hours, with impacts shaking the entire structure. Elena attempted to observe through the windows, but darkness and blowing snow made visibility zero. Mark finally fell asleep around midnight, when faint rustling from the covered porch awakened him after 1 a.m. Through the frost-covered window, Mark glimpsed something extraordinary. A massive fur-covered hand emerged from darkness to carefully grasp one of their sample containers, a specialized tube worth over $300 containing tissue samples. The hand appeared humanoid but far larger, with thick fingers covered in dense dark fur and sharp claws. It moved with deliberate precision, selecting the specific container before vanishing into the blowing snow within seconds. When Elena awakened at her normal 6 a.m. schedule, Mark immediately reported the incident and suggested they conduct a thorough investigation of the cabin's perimeter. Despite temperatures approaching -40 degrees, both researchers bundled into their heaviest Arctic gear to examine the area around their building for evidence of the previous night's disturbance. The discovery that awaited them in the morning light defied rational explanation and forced them to reconsider everything they thought they understood about Arctic wildlife. Enormous footprints pressed deep into the snow formed complete circles around the cabin, each print measuring over 24 inches in length, with clear toe impressions that suggested a bipedal creature of extraordinary size and weight. The tracks showed remarkable detail despite the previous night's blowing snow, indicating they had been made with tremendous downward pressure that compressed the frozen surface into hard-packed impressions. Most significantly, the prints led directly to the porch where Mark had witnessed the theft, then continued across the tundra toward a series of low hills approximately 2 kilometers distant, before disappearing into wind-scoured areas that retained no impressions. Their equipment and supplies had been subtly rearranged throughout the site, though nothing else appeared to be missing besides the single sample container. Snowshoes, emergency sleds, and backup fuel containers had been moved into precise geometric arrangements that suggested intelligence and purpose rather than random disturbance by wind or wildlife. Each item remained undamaged and functional, but positioned with mathematical precision that would have required considerable effort and planning. Most unsettling was the arrangement of their research materials. Scientific instruments, sample containers, and data recording devices had been sorted and stacked according to size and function, creating neat displays that resembled museum exhibitions rather than storage areas. Someone or something had clearly spent considerable time examining their equipment and organizing it according to unknown criteria. Elena attempted to contact their research supervisors via emergency radio, but atmospheric conditions and equipment limitations prevented clear communication with authorities in Whitehorse or Yellowknife. The nearest human settlement lay over 150 kilometers away across terrain that became impassable during severe weather conditions, making immediate evacuation impossible. even if they could establish contact with rescue services. Both researchers spent the following day recording their discoveries in meticulous written detail, though they acknowledged that few would find their accounts credible without stronger support. Despite the harsh cold making every task more difficult, Elena remained determined to preserve the clearest impressions of what they had witnessed. However, the psychological impact of feeling observed and scrutinized by something intelligent and powerful in the vast Arctic wilderness ultimately proved far more unsettling. Elena later described the unnerving sensation of unseen eyes upon them during every moment outside the cabin, while Mark admitted to a persistent anxiety that something might be lurking just beyond their limited field of vision in the endless tundra. On February 20th, both researchers made the difficult decision to abandon their research project and request immediate evacuation via the emergency communication system they finally managed to activate during improved atmospheric conditions. A military helicopter extracted them from the site 3 days later, though weather delays meant they endured several additional nights of tension and uncertainty before rescue arrived. The research station was permanently closed following their departure, officially due to budget constraints, but unofficially because no subsequent researchers volunteered for assignment to such an isolated location. Elena and Mark completed their Arctic fox study using data collected at other research sites. Though both avoided discussing specific details of their Yukon experience in professional publications, the remote tundra wilderness continued attracting scientific researchers and extreme adventure travelers, though experienced Arctic guides quietly advised against establishing camps in the specific area where Elena and Mark had encountered something that exceeded the boundaries of known wildlife behavior in Canada's Northern Territories.